Hi, Ethan. Bill Hargenrader here, answering your questions that you had about Mars exploration. Currently coming to you from my basement, the lab, books and weight behind me. Got to keep the mind and the body strong. So I'm going to read through your questions and give you some answers, and appreciate you reaching out. So first up, what do you think are the biggest challenges that face a manned mission to Mars, whether it be socially, economically, technical, or otherwise? So to start things off, just a little bit about my background. I'm a science fiction writer, Mars researcher, have a degree in information systems, so I like to apply how we see the challenges of getting to Mars in a project management type of methodology, so a very stepwise approach taking into consideration the different aspects that you mentioned. So instead of just focusing in on just one area, we take a broader spectrum so that we actually look to see what technologies would have the most impact, and then using basically a combination of research and synthesis, saying, hey, we've looked at all these different areas, all technologies that are needed. We're actually putting forward ideas to develop technologies as well. And so one of the biggest challenges that we face in manned mission to Mars is currently it's economical. And the reality is that it's expensive to get things to Mars. And with current technology, even if you were to take into account the amount that it costs for SpaceX, which is reducing the cost of getting things from ground up into Earth orbit and beyond, we're still looking at. I like to use the analogy, or at least an example of a meal that you eat, and just one meal consisting of a protein, a vegetable, a starch. That one meal, to get that from Earth to Mars, would cost around $8,000, and that's just one meal. So going through the day, you're looking at, for your meals, that's per one person, that's $24,000. So if you have a crew of 10 people, that's $240,000 a day just to have food that was shipped there, and that's been eaten. And so just that one problem right there, you start to see, well, this is a major portion of scale. So then when you look at, well, then how can we reduce that cost factor? You've reduced the cost factor by actually growing your food on Mars. Well, now if you want to grow food on Mars, you have to develop the technology, get the technology to Mars, which also costs money. You can use 3D printing to a certain extent and use local resources to develop it. But even so, what you end up looking at is a higher initial investment to grow your food on Mars as a longer term vision, where eventually you get your payback. It might cost 10 times as much up front to develop technology and ship it. But over the course of 10 years, you'd pay back your initial investment when you compare it to what it would take to ship food there. And then every year beyond that 10-year mark, that you actually it becomes a benefit to having the technology there. All of what we're talking about is having a long-term vision for people to live on Mars. And when you start talking about that longer-term vision, that's where you come back to that social aspect, where people are used to the idea of an exploration mission, or setting down boots and setting up flags like we did with going to the moon. And that's a great thing to do, but for people like myself, people in the Mars community, we don't just want to go to Mars and land, we want to go to Mars and live there. We do that for in my estimation, three reasons. The first one is peace. Some of the largest, most successful peacekeeping missions are the ones where we work, not even a peacekeeping mission, but where we work side to side with at the time, with people who we might consider, for whatever reason, an enemy, or somebody that's not like us. So the Olympics is a great example. We all come together and set aside our differences, and we play sports. The International Space Station is another example, where people in the Cold War, who were enemies, working side by side. And when you're fighting on the ground, when you look up and realize that we have billions of dollars of equipment, flying, in orbit overhead, it kind of makes you think, well, maybe we shouldn't be, fighting this much. And so when we go to Mars as a collaborative effort, taking into account international individuals. So for instance, India, ISRO, they have an amazing ability to send things to Mars cheaper on a much smaller price scale than we have. And so by combining efforts of different countries that have their strengths, we can make that trip to Mars more economical. We can actually address some of the societal issues, and that's where peace comes into play. Progress comes into play where we don't always do things just for practical purposes. We advance ourselves because it's inherent to us. Our drive to move ourselves forward is basically, it's built into our DNA. There's literally a wanderlust gene where people have this wanderlust gene, and they're more prone to wanting to travel, more to see more of the world, to explore. And I believe that since we have a certain portion of the population, I've know plenty of people. One of the things I run the Isle of Mars community, over 100,000 people around the world who are fans of going to Mars, whether themselves or to support someone else going. And there are people that would be willing to literally die just for a chance to go. And a lot of times the question will come up, or someone will make the statement, well, we shouldn't let people go to who have a higher chance of dying. Now, while I agree safety is important, reducing risk is incredibly important, we also let people drink, we let people smoke, we let people go and fight in wars, we let people do all these other things that are dangerous. And so if somebody wants to make the choice, the decision to go and raise their hand and say, hey, I basically want to do something, I feel called to this. This is something that will give me more than I think is part of my purpose, then I say by all means, let's not just let them go, but also basically help them get going. And then we talked about peace and then progress, and there's also protection. So the 3 P's: peace, progress, and protection. And protection is, the reality is, we've just very recently had one of the first, what we saw as one of the first objects from outside of our solar system, an asteroid coming through and then shooting off to leave the solar system again. That's just one example of what's out there that we weren't aware of. There are larger objects where essentially, when you look at the math and the statistics, we're due for a large impact. It happens, so often. And we have eyes in the sky that are mapping out, and there's a certain size object that we're looking for, but there's also the very real possibility that something could come in that we're not aware of, or multiple smaller objects and do some damage. So the idea of protection is important as well. What obstacles socially do you think humanity as a whole will have to overcome before, during, and after such a mission? And we talked about some of these. So cooperation between international governments, certainly cooperation with commercial organizations, and I like to take cooperation one step further. Not just to say, hey, we're going to pay this corporation to send our people, or hey, we're going to work out together with these nations. But I propose what's called a hybrid approach Mars mission, HAM. I feel like the acronym. And what that means is combining different mission objectives in such a way that costs are spread, risk is spread, and there's just and it basically ups that cooperation factor, which I think is important across the board. What that means is there are plans currently for NASA wants to go to Mars. One of the first things they're talking about doing is going to Mars to orbit. So essentially sending humans to Mars, orbiting the planet, and coming back. That's a reasonable, low risk win. It'll be the farthest that humanity's ever gone, but it's not touching down on the ground. Now, there's also people and organizations that want to go to Mars to stay, and start looking at ideas where you can combine a Mars to orbit with a Mars to stay. So if you can actually, as a payload, have habitats and landers that go with NASA as part of their mission that they're already doing, land to people that want to stay on Mars. They assume the risk of dying on impact and hopefully establishing a flourishing colony, but the risk of that not going through. That way NASA can have the win, and that organization can have the win, potentially. NASA can come back. What that might end up doing, though, is creating a mini space race. If there's an organization that wants to go to Mars to stay and land, then we start to say, well, NASA doesn't just want to orbit, let's also go to land. And so it kind of advances things forward. So when we start proposing ideas where you combine different mission objectives, it can actually advance the overall progress of all the organizations, because they don't want to be shown up, so to speak. So how will humanity benefit or change from such a mission, making humans a multiplanetary species? So this is, we talked about peace, we talked about protection, we talked about progress. One of the other things, though, is let's hone in on the progress aspect. I think it's already, we talked about the protection, that's important. But the progress aspect is, you can fall into the area of a couple different ways. One is, since economical is one of the challenges that we have, let's start to look for ways that we can increase the economic payback. And one of the ways of doing that is the idea of entertainment. It's when you go to Mars, the first person to write from Mars or to have a webcast from Mars, that's going to be a big deal. You can sponsor that webcast. The first person who writes the first book on Mars, that's going to be an instantaneous bestseller. The first person organization that makes wine on Mars, or beer on Mars, or cheese on Mars, or anything on Mars and sends it back, that then becomes a premium, like a massive premium. And so right there, by looking at just saying, not just we're going for the science of it, which is important, not just going to say we've done it, which is important, but also saying, if we're going for the long term, how can we set this up to be economically viable? And you start to look at those things right away. In addition to the economical, I mentioned the entertainment value. There's individuals, if you want to go and be a colonist on Mars, it's going to be hard work. It's going to be a lot of hard work. There's not going to be a lot of sitting around necessarily. You're building the colony. You're not just setting up a couple of habs to chill out and live in, and that's your existence. You'll be building a community. You'll be building a Mars city. And to do that, it's going to take every skill set, from construction to project management to waste removal to, there's certain things that we can say we will have robots to do, but there's also certain things that humans just do better. And when it comes down to, if you have enough people that want to go and be your workforce and be essentially your Mars population, be prepared to work. Obviously, enjoy the experience. You're living on Mars. It's just not going to be all, sitting back, chillaxing, and playing video games. Though maybe possibly you play video games later. All right. What do you think has been the biggest barrier in the pursuit of putting a man on Mars, both in society and technically? And so we can go back once again, economical factors, but then also let's take a look at societal factors. Let's take a look at who wants to send people to Mars. And I like to think of us going to Mars, essentially, it's a bit like a sporting event. It's basically like it's like NFL, except it's like the International Mars League. And, our sport is the actual exploration and colonization of Mars. And so if we just send humans to orbit, it's kind of like going to the playoffs, but not actually winning. And when we send humans to Mars and we have them send down to the surface and they step out on the ground and they touch down, it's kind of like scoring the winning touchdown in the Super Bowl. And there's a lot of people out there that are excited to see something like that. And there's actually, if you go to exploremars.org, there's an organization that they do research into what are the actual current polls. And in a recent poll, I think from 2016, of 1,000 people across the United States, not the largest pool of people, but it's still significant with the numbers. It's people that want to go to Mars is either agree or strongly agree is in the 60 to 70% range, plus 50. So 50, 60, 70% depending on the demographic. But that's a shift. That's a change. That's a change over time. And so the idea is what may have been a challenge in the past will not be a challenge in the future, as long as we have companies like SpaceX, as long as we have that are pushing the envelope, as long as we have individuals in government that say this is something we want to do, as long as we have researchers and sci-fi writers, Andy Weir, for instance, that wrote The Martian, the movie that came out that really inspires. It's essentially creating what's called a virtuous cycle. and that is, things are happening. It's like if you're waiting for the wave and the wave comes and catches you, then you're riding that wave. But if you're not ready for the wave, if you don't have the technology ready, if you're not saying this is the mindset we want to have, then you're not going to catch it. It'll just pass you by. And so what that means is it strongly stands to the individual responsibility to raise their hand, to repost. I mean, something as simple as reposting Mars articles on social media, just getting the word out there and getting people excited. My partner with Mars Now and I Love Mars, his name is Ron Sparkman. We recently gave a web lecture to a class at High Tech High in San Diego, and like, who wants to go to Mars? Tons of hands went up. Why do you want to go to Mars? Because it's cool. There's a cool factor around there. So this is the time right now where there's that cool factor where we can actually get stuff done. Anything else to add? I mean, we can go on and on, but there's really what it comes down to is it's, besides the practical reasons, there is the reasons that essentially, that are personal and individual to people. But for instance, like I said, I don't want to go to Mars and necessarily stay there. I would like to go to Mars eventually and come back. My wife currently won't let me do that, but we'll see how the technology evolves over time. But I think that we should let and encourage and find ways to help individuals that do want to go and stay, to have that happen, to make that happen for them. Because those are the individuals, those are the ones that are say, hey, I'll be an explorer. I'll go across, I'll climb this mountain, I'll sail this ocean, I'll find that thing. And so setting up an interplanetary species with Mars as the first step and beyond after that is going to take brave individuals at the right time in history where everybody's excited about it to make it happen. Because the reality is something could happen. We could wait 10 years or 20 years and, there's the next great war, or the next great national disaster, and it could throw the plans off tremendously. So strike while the iron's hot. And I hope that's been helpful for you, and I wish you well on your research project. All right, take care.